Buddy. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Jesus Pereira, and I'm the Associate Director of Community Partnerships here at the American Cancer Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for today's event, which is our Increasing Clinical Trial Participation webinar. We ask that if you are calling in from wherever you are calling in, if you could please just put your name and your organization in the chat box, we would greatly appreciate that. That way we are able to take attendance. Today, just during our call, we're going to have everybody muted just to make our presentation go just smoother. And we ask that if you do have any questions for us, please feel free to put those in the chat box for us. We will be taking questions today during our panel discussion and at the end, if time permits, at the end as well. And if we do not have time to answer all your questions today, fear not, we will be working with our presenters to look at those questions and we will get back to you as soon as we can after our presentation today. On the slide, you are just going to see here just our vision and mission statements here at the American Cancer Society. Our vision and mission statements serve as a foundation to all the work that we do here at the ACS. Next, I just wanted to give just a quick note here when it comes to continuing education for our physicians and clinicians that are in attendance. You will be receiving a claim to your continuing education credit within 2 weeks following the completion of a post-event survey we will have for all of you. The continuing education credits will be available for only the folks that do attend today's live webinar. I also wanted to note here just the objectives here of our webinar for today that are on the screen. Please note that these slides and all this information that we are going to be covering today will be made available after the presentation, and our event is being recorded. And thank you so much, Pam, for being so kind to record for us. And I briefly wanted to just touch on today's agenda for today. We're going to hear brief presentations from our wonderful panel of speakers. They're going to share their insight into their work in clinical trials. And after that, after our presentations, we're going to move into a more moderated panel discussion, which is going to be led by Dr. Sabrina Ford from Michigan State University before we close out our session. Next, I really wanted to say thank you to all our state cancer coalitions that are supporting our webinar today. We greatly appreciate your partnership, and we'd like to express appreciation to the Cancer Coalition, consortiums, and partnerships in the state of Alaska, Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming. Ooh, that was a mouthful. But if you've learned anything from our presentation from any of these amazing groups, please thank them for partnering with us here at the American Cancer Society. As a supporter of these informative discussions, we honestly could not do any of the work we do without them, and we greatly appreciate their support. I also wanted to give a big thank you before we get started to our 3 wonderful speakers and panelists that we have here today. Dr. Gotti from the University of Illinois Cancer Center, Michelle Lacey from Metro Minnesota Community Oncology Research, and of course, last but not least, Joanna Hill from Health Partners Institute Centers for Research and Education. And now to get us started, we'll have Dr. Gotti, who's batting leadoff today. Dr. Gotti is the Deputy Director of the University of Illinois Cancer Center, and he specializes in breast cancer. Dr. Gotti, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so honored to be able to participate in this important webinar, especially at this moment in time. I've titled this Carpe Futurum, so let's grab that future for all our patients. Next slide, please. So I came to the realization a few years ago after spending 20 years in the industry and kind of watching how healthcare innovation happens. And all too often, when we create something new, we sometimes create inadvertently winners and losers in the initial period of time. And I know that sounds like a lofty sort of statement, but I just wanted to operationally explain something that happened in real life. And on the left, you're looking at death rates by race in the United States related to breast cancer. And you can see in the 70s, 80s, really, there was no difference between what was observed in Black women and white women. But what happens over that time is that the death rates increase for a period of time for Black women, while it plateaus for white women and then starts dropping for both, but you see this persistent disparity between the two. And I usually ask this question in a live situation and people yell out answers to me, but I will just tell you the innovation that happened here was the widespread implementation of screening mammography. And so great tool, great test, life-saving test, but rolled out in a way where we created a new disparity. And the reason how this works is, of course, when we do screening, and this is the graphic on the right, we actually don't want to find people in advanced stage disease. What we want to do is stage shift them down. We want to find them before they know they have the disease. And we know typically that if you find a cancer early, you're far more likely to survive it. So this is the operational sort of characteristics of how, at least in this case of screening mammography, that innovation deepened disparity. But there are more examples, unfortunately. So I'm going to just highlight a few of these and then turn the tables on like what we can do. Next slide, please. So in the, oh, this should be automated. I mean, it should have, sorry for this, but essentially in breast cancer, we have these biomarkers now for women who've been diagnosed with breast cancer, and these have been incorporated into our NCCN guidelines to help us make decisions on who should or should not get chemotherapy. Unfortunately, when those biomarkers were developed, they were developed in tissues from idealized clinical trial patients at some of our largest cancer centers and not really representative of the entire country. And then this test, of course, looks good. It's presented in major conferences, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and, quote, becomes the standard of care. However, as we roll that test out into the general population, we can see that the test works differently. In this case, this recurrence score, this 21 gene recurrence score that helps us make chemotherapy decisions. In this graphic seen here by my colleague Ken Hoskins in JAMA Oncology a few years ago, shows that for all age groups, for all race groups, Black patients have a poorer performance in terms of having their cancers come back. And most concerningly, we are telling Black women that they don't need chemotherapy for certain groups when they might actually benefit from it, all because the biomarker was not developed in a robust representative group of individuals. So this is how a biomarker can create disparity. And the next slide, please. And then this slide, of course, is how drugs can also contribute to this. One of the most common mutated and messed up pathways in all cancers is this pathway related to a gene called a PI3 kinase or PIK3CA gene. It's often mutated in about 40% of all breast cancers. And we're lucky to have multiple companies develop drugs for this. And this is one such molecule called alpelisib that was approved only a few years ago. Next slide. However, as we looked at the enrollment tables for this particular trial, you can see there where it says Black and African American, in the cohort where the drug was approved, those are the patients with this mutation in their cancers, a grand total of 4 Black patients, 3 of whom were randomized to the placebo group. In other words, out of this trial with roughly 400 patients, there was a single Black woman whose experience informed us on whether or not this drug should get approved. This is problematic because we now know that insulin resistance is one of the ways that this drug doesn't work. And unfortunately, in the United States, with obesity and the epidemic around that, Black Americans are more often afflicted. And with this insulin resistance, not only does this drug not work as well, it's also potentially more dangerous to them. So we've created innovation and didn't test it in a way that we made sure it was safe for everybody, but also not effective for everybody. Next slide. So this is a age-old problem at this point now where we've had this issue where Black women in particular, but also other races and other groups are underrepresented on clinical trials. And we dove into this to identify kind of what are the characteristics of trials that lead to FDA approvals. And I apologize again for the first graphic there that's not showing up quite well, but it just shows you that we are underreporting race and ethnicity on these clinical trials. And then when we actually look at the statistics, not only are we underreporting them, the rate of women who fall into these underrepresented groups is substantially lower than what we see in the general population. In other words, if the general population has a 20% prevalence of Black individuals, we're enrolling them at roughly 10% that rate, for example. So we can see these kinds of disparities for multiple groups. And until we make sure these trials are available for everybody, unfortunately, some of the problems that you saw in the prior studies continue to be an issue. Next slide. So mostly I've just sort of set the table on what the problem is and just a handful of examples, primarily focused on breast cancer. I'm primarily a breast cancer doctor. And a few years ago, I left my then place of work, actually the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, to take on leadership roles here in Chicago at the University of Illinois Cancer Center. And I just want you to get a sense of who I work for. So in Chicago, we see tremendous disparities around cancer mortality, zip code by zip code, neighborhood by neighborhood. And my cancer center happens to be located and serve communities that have some of the highest cancer mortality statistics in the country. Moreover, when you look at those communities, they're also the same that are beset by hardships, whether that be poverty, structural and physical violence, environmental degradation, and so on. So not only is cancer bad in these areas, but there's social drivers as well as biologic drivers of why those disparities exist. This seemed like the perfect place for me to plant a flag to begin to tackle this question of healthcare disparities as it relates to cancer. Next slide. So there's too many drivers to list, and it can get overwhelming to identify why cancer inequity exists, whether it's rural, urban, Black, white, et cetera. But this is just a short list that we generated and sort of gave us a point of emphasis to start tackling the problem. The first and foremost is trust. Our communities need to trust us. And in order to have our trust, we need to listen. So we give voice to communities that have typically not had a voice in this particular fight. The other thing is you have to have a workforce that looks like, comes from, and understands the problems at hand. We can't have this concept, as well-meaning as it is, of health equity tourism where people that don't understand the problems fully are trying to solve them. They need to be integrated into those communities in an authentic way. We need to generate biospecimens from as diverse a community as possible so that those specimens then inform the research that takes place. And in order to even get those biospecimens, of course, we need to have the trust of the community. We really need to focus on clinical trials. What are those criteria that allow people to be on trials or exclude them? And what are the logistics that might stand in the way for people to participate? And what can we do around fixing those logistics? I will take some ownership of this. Our academic culture has a lot of publication and biases of other types that we need to start tackling, and fortunately we have been. There are regulatory and government constraints as well, and some more acute at this moment in time, but again, these are things we can tackle. And then lastly, we need to invite our corporate partners to understand these issues and then also make sure we are at the table when their decisions are being made so that they have a better understanding and picture. So these are just a handful of the ways that our cancer center has been focused on tackling these issues. Next slide. So at our cancer center, we have a striking statistic, which is 80% of the enrollments in our clinical trials for cancer come from underrepresented groups, Black and Latino primarily, but also other groups as well. And the way we've done this is we've worked with our community outreach and education office to identify needs and perform needs assessment to make sure that the trials match the needs. We have a federally qualified healthcare network that's embedded into our health system, in which place we can implement screening services but also survivorship care and then conduct research in those. As I mentioned earlier, what can we do around education and diversity in our workforce to make sure that the workforce is as broadly trained and coming from the most diverse communities possible in order to serve everyone? We analyze these statistics using resources that we not only make available to ourselves as cancer center investigators, but to community partners, but also importantly to legislative partners to make sure that their legislation that they write and pass is rooted in good cancer research. And then we lead community responsive research and a clinical trials office that meets the needs and looks frankly like the communities it serves. Next slide. So just going to highlight a few of these. This is a picture of our community advocacy board that supports our cancer center. You can just see from the pictures and the locations where they come from and how they inform every single aspect of our cancer center's operations. Next slide. And then again, on the goal of workforce diversification, as important it is to have a good project for a junior investigator, we want to bring resources. And here I want to really shout out to the American Cancer Society for their Cancer Health Equity Research Awards that they began giving out a few years ago, We were one of the inaugural institutions to receive one of those. And I will say we put them to very good use. And those investigators have gone on now to leverage that initial support towards getting additional support from other funding agencies, including the National Institutes of Health. Next slide. And then when it comes to clinical trial enrollment, we see gaps all over the place, and we see studies for which our patients are simply not eligible. So our solution to this problem is to write our own studies. And while that is workable to a point, it demonstrates the feasibility of including populations that are very diverse onto studies, and then becomes a talking point when we approach companies, drug companies, and other types of companies to say, this is feasible. It's not just a pointing the finger and saying, no, the problem's over there. You guys don't want to be on our studies. It turns out, and this is a very true statistic, if given the opportunity to participate on research and adequately and properly explained, almost everybody will accept. And that has been our experience, and that's why we see the numbers we see. Next slide. And so I'll just close with this, and I hope I didn't put you to sleep right after lunch. The heart of equitable precision medicine is that we match patients for the correct treatment for the disease being targeted. And right now we have tremendous mismatch in the way that we conduct clinical research in the United States. And by doing so, create not only disparities related to those innovations, but we also potentially put patients and others at harm's way. So we need to urgently correct this. There are true enough longstanding systemic barriers, but if you don't start identifying them and breaking them down, we'll never get past them. And just as a way of doing this, I've highlighted a few examples that we've been able to do at our cancer center. I'm sure there are more, and we're also happy to partner with others to identify newer ones and continue to tackle these. And then if we can overcome this collectively, I think we can really challenge the paradigm of business as usual. There's a lot of woe is us in this field, and I think it's time is here to kind of tackle these issues aggressively and really challenge this business as usual attitude. And in the end, the goal is, of course, that we ensure all citizens have the right to a healthy life, whether it's in cancer or any other health domain. And with that, I'll close up and hand it off to the next speaker. Thank you, Jesus.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation, Dr. Gotti. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very, very informative, and we greatly appreciate it. And next, to keep us going here, we are going to have our next speaker, which is Michelle Lacey. Michelle Lacey has been the director for the Metro Minnesota Community Oncology Research Consortium and she has 37 years of experience as an oncology nurse and 31 years of experience in clinical trials. Michelle, thank you so much and welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm honored to be able to provide some information today. And after listening to Dr. Gotti's comments, I think maybe some of my content is taking a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the themes that he presented. So again, I'm Michelle Lacey, and I am associated with the Metro Minnesota Community Oncology Research Consortium. We are an NCORE site. If you have a familiarity with the NCI grant program of the NCORE. A couple of my slides, you can go to the next slide, or just kind of an intro to my background or my kind of clinical care setting. This is just the front page of our website. And we really are the community hospital access in the metropolitan Twin City areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul to work with trials. We have 22 sites. Go to the next slide, please. So really the theme I just wanted to kind of point out for us, and really is part of our mission, and it aligns very closely with the theme of ASCO, which is clinical trials available everywhere, anytime, to everyone. And really our simplistic philosophy is that every patient really does have the right to know if there is a clinical trial opportunity available to them. And so in our work that we do, we really try to follow that philosophy. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why patients say yes, and also then why patients say no, to kind of help with kind of the content here that we're trying to present. So why do patients say yes? You know, obviously participation can allow them to receive newer or better treatments, and they also sometimes want to give back to others. But really, depending on the individual, the others might be their family, friends, or patients with the same condition. But we always kind of talk about kind of really getting to know our patients really well, especially in that informed consent, conversation of, their interests, why they might be interested, what are their goals, and really trying to get them to know them to really establish that trusting relationship with them. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about why they say yes or when they do. So research shows that the recommendation of the physician or the provider really is a key support to the patient's decision to enroll in a clinical trial. So within our site, we work very closely with our providers to identify patients that may be eligible for a trial, but then also in presenting that to our patients. Talking to the patient about participating in a trial really does require a unique set of communication skills and an understanding of the factors that influence their decision. And I think Joanna Hill is going to get into that a little bit more with the Just Ask program. Patients don't always have the proper information about their disease and condition, so to identify trials, for them to identify trials that for which they might be eligible. So our goal really, if we have the resources to screen all of our patients, we do that. We have looked at potential AI kind of mechanisms to help with that. Also looked at Epic and Slicer Dicer and different reports that we can run to help with our screening. If you go to the next slide, please. So then on the reverse of that, why do patients say no? Really, it's down to as easy as they don't have the information they need to say yes. Sometimes they wonder about the direct cost for the treatment, the details about transportation, parking, and reimbursement, what kind of financial toxicity it might bring to them, and also the time commitment and lost time from work and family. And the term I've been hearing lately is kind of the time toxicity that it takes to go through treatments and or to even participate in trials. Next, please. So the patient interest in research is really imperative. An interest in seeking the best care possible is cited as a primary reason for them to be taking part in clinical trials. So really, it kind of goes back to really making or assuring that the patient has the general understanding, and we understand what their beliefs are about research going into those education-informed consent sessions. How is the option presented to them? We talked about that there's physician support and also specific interest in one or more potential trials. Sometimes the patients bring the trials to us. They may have done some type of a search in clinicaltrials.gov, or they may have a familiarity with a trial, and they might bring it to us and see that we are a participating site. And so then we are also doing further education in that from that perspective. The next, please. So just a couple more slides just to talk about the proverbial, 3 to 5%. And I think that this number kind of vacillates in terms of the enrollment of patients, adult patients onto clinical trials. And, polling has showed that 80% of the public is theoretically willing to participate in a trial, especially when the trials are recommended by their healthcare provider. So I think about Dr. Gotti's, comments of it's 80% of the patients that we are reaching, right? We don't reach some of those patients that potentially may be eligible, but the ones that we are able to reach are willing to participate. But there is this cross-cutting issues that affect the actual willingness. So we would love to see, and I've worked over the many years to try to increase the percentage of patients that are enrolled onto the adult clinical trials. So if you go to the next trial, please, or the next slide. So again, 4 reasons most cited that affect the willingness of the patient. The fear of side effects, the loss of control, and then we'll talk a little bit about that on my next slide, the logistical challenges, and also the costs. Next, please. So this is my last slide, and I know that some of the information is small print, but it really just isn't a kind of a comprehensive look at cancer patients, and why their reasons were for declining trials. We, with the NCI trials that we do collect that information on why they may not be participating. Mary Lou Smith, who some of you may know, who is a strong patient advocate, I know her through the association with the ECOG Akron research base, but she also has involvement nationally with the Research Advocacy Network. And one of the things that she has mentioned is that the randomization situation is really a huge issue for patients. And it talks about, kind of their body is kind of out of control. They've had this new diagnosis. They really feel like the setting is kind of out of control. And then when you go into a clinical trial, that there's randomization that is also out of the control. So that's something that sometimes is hard for patients to get over that barrier. Some of the other things listed on the left hand of the side of the screen is also things that I've already mentioned about the fear of side effects, the loss of control, the logistics. So I think in summary, there's patient willingness if they are approached in the manner by their providers, if they're educated, if there's this trusting partnership, and if we can do something about some of the barriers that they may perceive, I think then we can have increased success. So I think that's my last slide. If you want to, there you go. I just wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity. And if anybody has any questions or would like to reach out to me to partner on anything, there's some of my information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that wonderful, wonderful, very insightful presentation. And like Michelle said, here's just her contact information here. If anybody wants to just grab that here while I finish speaking. If not, we will also have that. We'll have these PowerPoint presentation available for you after. But to keep us going, next we have our final speaker here for today. We have Joanna Hill here batting cleanup for us today. Joanna is currently the Senior Director of Health Partners Institute of Cancer of Research and Education in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. She brings over 25 years of experience in overseeing research and clinical operations with both academically and community-based healthcare systems. Joanna, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Great, thank you for having me. And I echo the same thing that Michelle and Dr. Gotti said. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the importance of aligning clinical trial enrollment with real world populations. So next slide, please. So you might ask, why is this important? And it's really important to align that to what Dr. Gotti and Michelle alluded to is it's essential to ensure that our study findings are broadly applicable, equitable, and reflective of the diverse patient populations who will ultimately use these therapies or interventions that we're testing. The alignment enhances the generalizability of results and helps identify potential differences in treatment effectiveness or safety across subgroups, and supports the goal of reducing health disparities. Next slide, please. So I don't know if you've seen this equation before, but this was brought up from ASCO and ACCC and their initiative to increase racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials. But we're looking at the health disparities equation here. And what happens is if we have less research and less health information with less access to healthcare, but more negative outcomes, that's really what leads to health disparities, and why it's so important that we look at these things and try to combat some of these parts of this equation. Next slide, please. So what are the barriers for achieving representative participation in a clinical trial? And again, Dr. Gotti went through some of these. I'm going to go into them in a little bit more in depth, but we'll talk about some key ones and what things you might be able to do to help knock down these barriers. Next slide, please. So the first one is, health systems may not adequately address the socioeconomical or socio-cultural factors that impact the patients and communities that they serve. As Dr. Gotti pointed out, sometimes that biomedical workforce is not reflective of the communities they serve. And I remember going to a Breath of Hope series one time, and there was a physician there from Northwestern giving a talk on this exact same thing. And she said, when she approaches patients for clinical trials, there are some patients say, oh my gosh, she was a woman of color, and said, thank God, I don't I don't have a lot of doctors that look like me, and you look like me. And so that was a little bit of just kind of instant gaining trust, just because they felt that there was this natural connection, based on being of the same race or ethnicity. Also, we have times where, yes, there are patient materials that we have translated into different languages, but again, sometimes that gets expensive. And so that sometimes, not purposefully, but becomes a deterrent in that, having to get consent forms in multiple different languages, and sometimes the funding's just not there for that. So, we're lucky if we can get, pharmaceutical sponsors to pay for that. But, what happens when there isn't that funding, and we have to rely on federal funding or some other funding sources that may not be as robust. Next slide, please. So obviously, inequitable practices create systemic and, structural challenges and barriers to participate in a clinical trial. A lot of times there's unavailability of trials outside large academic health centers. We're trying to, and in Minnesota and other states as well, obviously trying to get more trials out available in rural areas, and more towards the community outside of the urban areas. We have to think about offering trials and options outside of regular business hours. This is a big one, is that, patients have work, they have, other commitments, and it's really hard to get to the clinic in the middle of the day sometimes. Requires taking off of work. Efficiency, limits time spent with patients, especially in a community center where you're in RVU, driven organization. There's restrictions on how, not restrictions, but you just feel the time constraints of how much time you're spending with patients. So, knowing that you have patients, that you have to see, that you're already running behind for non-research purposes, and then trying to explain the research to a patient, that takes a little extra time. And that's just, you don't want to be late for your next patients. Also, access to special or vulnerable populations. So there's no access for, we talk about translating consents and such, but, what about patients who are visually or hearing impaired? Next slide, please. There's also a history, as you may know, of distrust. There's been a history of, researchers that have historically exploited or harmed certain communities. So that trust, while we've done a lot to rebuild that, that does still exist. So we have to constantly work on ways to be able to build that up. Next slide. I will say about that. There's also fear. There are some communities that just in general fear kind of going to the doctor, and fear healthcare systems in them of themselves. So then you combine that with, research and the fear of the unknowns. And, Michelle spoke a little bit about the fear of loss of control with randomization. So all of those things really kind of combine and build up. And so it really does become a big barrier. Also, there's also the fear of institutional sharing or of personal information or loss of privacy. Our consent forms, especially for cancer, are several pages long. We have information about where their information should be shared from, but it's quite overwhelming. And patients definitely worry about, what if that, once the data leaves my organization, where does that data get shared, and how can we prevent that loss of privacy? Next slide. There's also the barrier of information, awareness, and access. There's poor communication of the purpose and process of research. There have been some statistics and some polling that people aren't even really aware that they were asked to participate in a research study. And in fact, the advice is to be very deliberate. And when you're asking a patient to participate, make sure that you say, we'd like to ask you to participate in a research study. I think that initially some people would think, oh, I don't want to mention research because that's a scary word. But without mentioning research, patients don't really understand that it is indeed research. It's hard for patients to navigate those complex health systems. it's difficult for them to navigate things for their regular clinical care, let alone the complexities that are loaded on top of billing and such for as part of a clinical trial. And then some groups are asked less frequently than others to participate in clinical research. We all have our own uh, uh, um, you know, hidden biases, and we have to make sure that we're really asking as many people as that may qualify for clinical trials if they can qualify. One example Michelle actually shared with me not too long ago was, you can't assume that, a 75-year-old woman doesn't want to participate in a questionnaire study because those questionnaires are done on a tablet, and you're afraid that she's not going to want to know, or she's going to be afraid to work that tablet. So you always want to make sure that, if the patient is, appears to be eligible, that you ask them instead of assuming that they may not want to participate or they will be unable to participate. Next slide, please. Also, research-related barriers, and again, Dr. Gotti talked about this. We have these complex protocols, comorbidities that often exclude patients. I always talk about there's no such thing as a healthy cancer patient. Cancer patients and carry other comorbidities that affect their ability to be able to participate in the study, because the study wants to control all of those confounding factors so tightly. But really what it makes is a study that's not recruiting real world people into their study, because not everybody has just cancer. There's people who have diabetes, people who have heart problems and such. So really have to look at if comorbidities are excluded, what really is the reason for this? Is it really a harmful, a case of preventing harm? Obviously, we want clean data, but looking at really what matches our real world patients. Obviously, the complex protocols with inflexible schedules, time constraints on recruiting, and then research results are not always shared. And I know a bunch of research groups, including the cooperative groups and the NCI, and also places like Breath of Hope and ASCO and ACCC, are looking for ways to break down these research-related barriers, because these are ones that we can better control than others. Next slide, please. So really the first thing we want to do when we're looking at breaking down these barriers is we want to look at our patients and figure out who they are and think about their experiences and what makes them up. We talked about that there's no such thing as a healthy cancer patient in the sense, or they just have cancer. We have to take into consideration other factors that make them who they are. You might have the single patient or the single parent who's also a disabled parent, a elderly female, as I spoke about with the tablet example, or you have a patient who lives in a rural area or is impoverished. And then next slide, please. Once you throw cancer into the mix, it really does create a more complicated profile of the patient that you have to consider. The patient without cancer, you throw cancer into the mix. So what barriers are maybe more prone to that patient because of the things that are all going into the makeup of them? Next slide, please. So that's when ASCO and ACCC came up with an initiative as part of their, to increase racial and ethnic diversity. And they came to the conclusion that, really an essential part of this recruitment process is recognizing that, as we just talked about, patients as a whole, and that they're not just, potential study patients, that they're human beings that have different goals, different concerns, different life circumstances. And we really have to know those in order to really present the option to patients and to help them navigate through those barriers and make them more likely to consider the clinical trial. We don't want someone to not consider a treatment that may be helpful to them just because they are concerned about parking, or they're concerned about, time off of work, or they're concerned about missing their son's t-ball game or such. Next slide. So here are some things of what to ask. You want to look at the personal context of the patient. Find out what their day-to-day life is and what matters most to them, and who do they rely on for support. You want to look at their past healthcare experience and, have they had any negative experiences? And is there someone that they have with them that's important to be in the decision making, or does that person have to be contacted? So maybe if you're wanting to discuss a clinical trial with them, you want to make sure that that person is there with them, and make sure that you're not just picking a convenient time for the patient, but picking a convenient time for their support person or persons. Considering cultural or spiritual or personal values to keep in mind. Again, in some cultures, there is a father figure or mother figure or a priest or, someone else that's, very pivotal in their decision making. And you want to make sure that those people are included in the decision, because those are important people for the patient to be with when trying to make these decisions. You want to look at, time and, other logistics, transportation and scheduling, what a typical work week looks like for them. Do they have, do they normally watch their granddaughter on Wednesday? Wednesday starting at 2. How do they feel about, traveling to the center of, maybe a few more times than they normally do? What's their comfort level of navigating in the hospital to different areas? If they have to go to some area that they might not be used to within the hospital. Asking about their experience just with their past health care. What was their experience with with their diagnosis and their treatment so far? If they've had a really, not so great experience with some of their treatments, less side effects and such, that might make them think, whoa, I don't want to try anything new here. Ask them about any challenging aspects. Again, with the side effects, what side effects have affected them more. Obviously chemotherapy has more side effects than, some immunotherapies. So, finding out if those are the personal barriers of the patient, and discussing the differences between what therapies they've had in the past and what therapies are involved in the current study. And then also find out the main concerns of their health. If you have a patient that has, diabetes, finding out a new study that might be prone to causing hyperglycemia, you might want to think about that, and make sure the patient's aware of that in case they're a little bit nervous about participating in that. Figure out what they already know about clinical trials, dispel any myths that they may be carrying with them because they really don't know that much about clinical trials, or they've only heard, the horror stories of them, so to speak. Help them to feel more comfortable and confident about participating, and ask them how they prefer to get information. Do they like it through a MyChart communication where it's in writing so they can share it with their, a friend or their, pastor or whoever, and they want to make sure that they don't misquote anything, so they like it in writing? Do they like conference calls with their whole family there? Find out what makes them comfortable. And then also the cost and insurance issues. What is it that has made care getting harder, and what can you and your clinic do to help ease those financial stress or burdens, just in general, just with the regular clinical care, and how you will handle that if they participate in a study, so it's not an extra burden to them on top of the rest of their billing for their clinical care. And I think that was the last slide for me. So just put my information up here in case you would like to connect or you have any questions. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to the discussion in the panel.
Thank you so much for that, Joanna. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And like you said, her information is right there if you'd like to contact her or have any questions for her. But next, as Joanna alluded to, we are going to be moving on here to our moderated panel discussion. And I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel moderator, Dr. Sabrina Ford. Dr. Sabrina Ford is an associate professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Health in Biology. And she's also the Director of Health Quality and Equity in the Institution of Health Policy at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. I grew up a big Wolverines fan, Dr. Ford. We might have to have a word later.
Well, no, we don't have to, because underneath I wear fur Wolverine clothing.
Oh, fair enough. Okay,
So,
touche.
but we get to have a good representation of Big Ten today, and I'm really proud of that. But welcome to everybody who's joined us on this call. Is it okay for me to go ahead and get started?
The floor is yours, Dr. Ford. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Wonderful job, Jesus, and uh, extremely informative and important presentations on this issue that's been really difficult to untangle for probably decades now. I mean, that we've been thinking and talking about it. And I just have one quick comment before we get into the questions. You know, you all presented the multi-level kind of approach to how do we get at that? How do we break down barriers? Or, you know, maybe that's not a word that's allowed. I like the advisory board. One of the things that I've been thinking about and actually wrote a paper about was who is on the NIH review committees and who are getting grants. And that's also a difficulty if you think about Black women or minorities in general, and even rural citizens who don't have a chance to actually sit on the advisory or the review panels, and then also get grants for their work at a much lower level. So that's something that we can all pitch in as well, as to really kind of change that culture. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I'm gonna ask Dr. Gotti, but this is for everyone really. How does limited enrollment in cancer clinical trials affect outcomes across different populations, particularly in terms of cancer mortality? It's a big question, but Dr. Gotti, and then everyone can join in.
Of course, thank you so much, Dr. Ford. So there's a few ways I think it manifests. One I highlighted, which is if you test the drug in what I call an idealized clinical trial population. In other words, all the variables are controlled. Every patient looks kind of more or less interchangeable in terms of their characteristics or features, their background, their wealth status, whatever you call it. Then you've really answered the question in a perfectly designed experiment, and all you have is an answer for that perfectly designed experiment. And really, we have two solutions. One is we perpetuate this, and then we try to capture evidence in the real world, and that's been the way that most people have gone about it. But that real world evidence is often perceived as lower quality. It takes longer to accrue. Funding for it is uneven. Fortunately, with the innovations around AI and machine learning and being applied into health systems, we're starting to tackle some of these in a good and robust way, but it's still an imperfect solution. The other way to do it is, of course, open the trials at places that are not all identical and try to get as diverse a patient group onto those studies, and then answer the question in that diverse clinical trial population. And then you have an answer that was prospectively gathered without all the biases we worry about, and I think comprehensively and meaningfully answers the question. Unfortunately, while some folks are heading in this direction, you also see trials heading in the other directions. It's harder to do trials in the United States. The trials are, especially in oncology, are more globalized, and the fraction, if anything, of representation of typical American populations on these studies is plummeting, such so that even at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting that just happened, some of the top line, most exciting data that were presented have low single-digit representation, for example, from Black women. Latino women is also pretty low as well. So, you know, it keeps me up at night that these are some of the challenges, and just a couple ideas of how they contribute to sort of inequities once the drugs hit the market, as an example.
Wow, that was an incredible answer and very comprehensive. And I think that it's so true. It's the little things that we don't necessarily think about, and actually moving into the community rather than kind of bringing the community to the trial. And I really like that idea. Michelle and Joanna, would you like to speak about that?
Sure, I can comment just a little bit further. I mean, I think about our consortium and our grant funding that really is helping to facilitate that, out of that the trials aren't only being done at the academic centers. You know, the statistic, I think, only 20% of patients are seen in the academic setting, whereas 80% are out in the community. So I think that that is a long-term approach of trying to get out of a homogeneous group of patients or individuals, but I do think that there obviously is further work that we can do that can get more out into those underserved communities to assure that we are getting real world data. I've seen a couple of trials that have kind of come forward from some of the NCI research bases that are looking at that. They're saying, okay, we have the potential FDA indication for this drug. We had a trial that looked at this, but let's really look at the real world data, and it's more of a data collection study to assure that data kind of aligns with where the indication, results were. So I think we're trying, but I think that it's not easy. And maybe then I turn it over to Joanna for your comments and your great ideas.
Well, I just think about building the infrastructure at some of these, rural communities, health clinics too. I mean, to run studies, as you all know, that are involved in clinical research, there is a lot that you have to build to be able to do these studies. And, currently some of these smaller clinics don't have that infrastructure, and we need to invest in that to make sure that, we are bringing those trials to the patient instead of asking the patients to come to us.
Right.
So I think that's really important. I think about that infrastructure piece.
Well, that kind of leads right into my next question, because all of you mentioned community resources, infrastructure, going to the patients. So, in your experience, and I'm going to start with Michelle, how can community resources, particularly rural, play a role in increasing participation and addressing the barriers that limit clinical trial enrollment?
That's a really great question, Dr. Ford. And I immediately think about within the state of Minnesota. There, over the last 7 years, there has been the Minnesota Cancer Clinical Trials Network that has been funded by, state, legislative appropriated funds. And so we have all kind of a lot of the different healthcare entities throughout the state of Minnesota, along with the university, have developed and created this network so we can serve the patients who are out in the rural communities. That's a specific. But I'm here to say after 7 years, it's not as easy as you think it is. There's funding, there's money, but there isn't stability of physicians potentially or oncologists out at those sites. So you have a lot of turnover. You have the instability potentially of the workforce resources, whether you have a research nurse or whoever it may be. The patients are a far distance and that type of thing. So I was convinced through this project that it's not as easy as you think it was if you just have the money to do it. It really, there's things that are beyond our control. And then lastly, and then I'll let somebody else kind of answer the question. I think this all makes me think of the decentralized clinical trials, effort that I know that is going on nationally. And there's a lot of talk within the NCI also. And ACCC, I sit on a committee there, and just talking about how can we do better at kind of serving the rural communities and by doing more decentralization.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to take that just a bit further with you, Joanna, in terms of thinking about, you mentioned infrastructure. What kinds of things play a strong role in terms of building infrastructure and resources needed? And I know that's a loaded question.
Just a few things. One thing when you're looking at, in different investigational drugs, you really need to make sure that you have someone in pharmacy that's, assigned to really knowing these investigational products and being able to do training and some teaching with some patients. So I think, pharmacy is one of them. Another is laboratory. There are certain we send out a lot of labs to central labs for studies, but sometimes you have to do, different processes within the hospital. So being equipped to be able to run those research samples within the lab. I think about too is just to Michelle's point about how it's not as easy as just throwing, money at it. And I 100% agree. And I just wonder if we can think about some other options, who is, using kind of some mobile phlebotomy services so that maybe if the patient does have to travel to a hospital that's not so far away, they don't have to travel as often because they can have their blood drawn before that I would love, is there mobile, radiology services? There's mobile mammography. So let's think about how we can bring different services to the patient that could help as part of that research study. And that would help clinically too, with just treatment in general. So I think if we can find a mix of both, of building the infrastructure and also figuring out a way to bring the services to the patient, I think eventually we'll be able to build the full infrastructure so that we can have everything at those smaller clinics. But, in the meantime, trying to split the baby a little bit and try to see what we can do on both sides.
Great answer. We have time for just one more question. And Dr. Gotti, I'm going to start with you on this one. What role can healthcare providers, physicians play in increasing all healthcare providers increasing clinical trial participation? And so once they get in, how can we support?
That's a great viewpoint to put a little skin in the game for the docs, right? Like not just complain about it.
Right.
But they obviously so many of our doctors are advocates just in general, and it's this implicit understanding that clinical research is the best care. And if you start from that perspective, because let's be honest, there's nothing in oncology that is so sacrosanct that we can't make it better. And the only way we're going to make it better is through investigating it and researching it. And the minute all of us, the primary care physicians, all the way to the medical oncologists, recognize this, I think we can become advocates for research because it is the best care. And I think we're all interested in that. Once our minds reframe the question in this way, it's a slam dunk from there. I think we will do whatever we can, bend over backwards to lower barriers for our patients to participate, to demystify the processes, to explain the interventions as best as we can. And if they see our enthusiasm, and I think this is where that 80% number comes in, they know that the healthcare provider is bought in and you have a trusting relationship, the patient follows. And at least in my own practice, I've seen that. I've worked very, very hard, as do all my colleagues, at establishing a therapeutic relationship that is beyond functional. And then once you get that, the rest really falls into place.
And so we have two, I thought we had two, we have 1 minute left, but any follow-up, Michelle or Joanna? Thank you, Dr. Gotti. That was a great answer.
Joanna, you can go ahead if you have a comment.
The only quick thing I'll say is that, as we look at the NCCTN guidelines, at the bottom of every guideline, it says that a clinical trial is the best option for the patient. So, to Dr. Gotti's point, that's the bottom line, literally.
Okay. All right. I will hand it back over, but first I have an advertisement. I am an ambassador for Voices of Black Women, which is not a randomized controlled trial, but it is an ACS project that's in recruiting 100,000 Black women in a lifestyle study. And so all of us probably know a Black woman in our life that is between 25 and 55. If you don't know about it, you can go Google Voices for Black Women, but also your ACS partner or friend can also tell you about it. I'll hand it back over to Jesus.
Thank you so much for that. What a what a wonderful, wonderful panel we had. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for also shouting out that study as well, for our Women of Voices. That is something that we all as an organization are working to do that. I know we're at time, folks. I promise I'll be quick here. I just wanted to give a few reminders here before we wrap up. Just want the first reminder, please just whenever you get just please take your post-webinar survey. We would greatly appreciate all your feedback and input to make sure we are giving you the best experience possible here at the American Cancer Society. And of course, for our clinicians that are here as well, please fill that out as well so you get your continuing education certificates. I also want to thank you, Dr. Ford, and our three wonderful panelists, Dr. Gotti, Michelle, and Joanna, for such an informative and thought-provoking conversation today. Just an amazing, amazing experience. Thank you so much here. As we close out here, I just wanted to say that our continuing education certificate will be sent out within 2 weeks once you've completed that post-webinar survey. We will also include a post-event email, which will have the recording of today's event and that survey link. And just one final reminder, those continuing education credits are only available for today for the folks that attended here live. But lastly, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And thank you for everybody here on this call for their commitment to fight to fight for a world without cancer. We really hope to see you at our next webinar in our series of Cancer Continuum Learning Series. The next topic that we have here on deck for all of you is understanding food insecurity's impact across the cancer continuum. And the date for our next webinar is going to be the 24th of September of 2025 at the same time, 3 o'clock Central Time, or wherever you might be joining us here in the world. We have all of those time zones here listed out for you. And we also have a QR code here for you if you would like to register for that just for our next webinar. We'll leave that up here as well, and you can scan that while we finish up. But once again, everybody, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to join us here. I hope you were able to take something away and were able to really get something out of this. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us here at ACS. It's our job to help you, and it's our pleasure to be able to help answer any questions. But I hope everybody here has a wonderful, wonderful weekend. If you celebrate Juneteenth, please have a wonderful, wonderful long weekend. Celebrate with your family and your loved ones, and take some time to rest for yourself. But we'll see you all next time, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.